Welcome to Boswell Book Company, the Readings from Oconomowaukee series with Books Company in Oconomowoc. It is day 5,317 of us being in business. And with that, I pass the mic to Lisa Baudoin, who's going to introduce today's author.
Hi, Nathan Hill is a best-selling author of The Knicks, which was named one of the best books of the year by NPR, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Slate when it was published in 2016. His new book, Wellness, is destined for a similar fate, with the added bonus of being an Oprah Club selection. NPR's Michael Schaubs calls Wellness a stunning novel about the stories that we tell about our own lives, our loves, and how we sustain relationships throughout time. It's beyond remarkable, both funny and heartbreaking, and sometimes on the same page. A native Iowan, Nathan lives with his wife in Naples, Florida, and he is here to join us tonight for a conversation.
We promised we wouldn't do the same question, so Lisa is now going to ask you for your escalator pitch. Oh, this way, yeah.
Yeah, we've already done this once today already, and sorry, I told all the best stories already earlier this afternoon, so there's nothing left, like just like read from the bibliography, I guess.
Dirty limericks.
Thank you for coming. Look at everybody here. Thank you for coming out tonight.
Do you want to give us an escalator pitch?
An escalator pitch?
It's longer and more inclined.
Oh. Yeah, so Wellness is a book about a marriage. It's a book about Jack and Elizabeth. Jack comes from the plains of Kansas, from the Flint Hills, an area of the world that I'm familiar with from living in Wichita, Kansas for a while. And Elizabeth comes from an old money New England family, and they meet in Chicago. And these two are kind of running away from dysfunctional families. They are in Chicago to become orphans, and they find each other. And the setting is Wicker Park in the early 90s, at a time when the neighborhood is still very bohemian. It's the place where all the poets and musicians go for cheap rents in this period. And it doesn't seem like the grunge era was very important for me. I was in high school and college during that time, and it doesn't feel that far away in my imagination. But like, I was reminded how antique I am recently when I was at a bookstore in Brooklyn, and a young woman in the signing line came up, and she was probably 22, maybe 23 years old, and she says, "I really like the 90s part of your novel." And I said, "Wow, thanks. Are you interested in the 90s?" And she said, "No, I just really like historical fiction." I just was like, oh boy. It's come to that. Anyway, so Jack and Elizabeth meet in the late 1900s, in the 90s, and fall immediately in love. It's a very Romeo and Juliet, thunderbolt, lightning bolt, love at first sight, whatever kind of meeting. And then the book very quickly fast forwards 20 years, and life has happened to them. They've been married for a long time. They have a son who presents certain challenges. They feel a little lonely. They feel, as parents, very overwhelmed, and they are looking back at those hopeless romantics they used to be, and they're sort of wondering, how could those people also be us? And then the rest of the novel is an excavation of what brought them to this place, and also a lot of hijinks as they attempt to kind of spice it up a little bit.
Do you want to ask the first question?
Yeah, I would love to. You said I lied and said we wouldn't say anything again, but and I'm sure you've all did what we did, which was watch like 25 interviews and find out what all the best questions are. But I think everybody, if you aren't too well informed about the book, you should know that the book began as a short story, and I'd love for you to sort of expound on that. And also, I'm curious, when you wrote the story, how much you knew about the characters that wasn't in the story.
When I wrote the short story?
Yes.
Yeah. So the chapter 1 in the novel was actually written about 20 years ago. I had just finished my schooling, and I'd moved to New York City, and I had this little studio apartment in Astoria, Queens, and it had one little window that looked out onto a brick wall of other windows, and into other apartments. And I just imagined two lonely people kind of getting glimpses of each other through the windows across the alley, and slowly becoming interested in each other and kind of falling in love with each other, and kind of liking what they're seeing, from the other person. And I wrote that as a short story, maybe a 3 or 4 page story, and promptly forgot about it until like 15 years later, when I had finished writing the Knicks. It hadn't come out yet, but I had finished like my edits, and I was looking for what my next project would be. And I remembered that story, and in my 20s, I thought it was really romantic, and then in my 40s, happily married for a long time, I was like, these two are idiots, like like they're like projecting these fantasies of what they want their life to look like onto this other person without even knowing them, and so I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to follow them? Wouldn't it be interesting to, if those two got together back then, what would have happened? And if the world got as weird as the world has actually gotten, what would have happened to them? And so, yeah, I started writing, and so when you read the book, like, it should feel seamless. Chapter 1 to chapter 2 should feel very seamless, but for me, there was like a 15-year gap between writing those 2 chapters, and honestly, I didn't know much about the characters when I wrote that short story. What was most important, it's only a 3-page story, so you don't have a lot of time for character development. What I really liked about the story was just the image at the end where he's waiting for her to get home, and he's sitting in the dark, and she's waiting for him to get home, and she's sitting in the dark, and they're actually staring right at each other, but they don't know it. I liked that image. There's these 2 people waiting, and they don't know that the other is doing exactly the same thing. I just like the kind of irony of that. So I didn't really know the characters at all. And so when I was building this book, I sort of took the characters that I was building and kind of applied them and rewrote those 2 characters from the original story.
I mean, in a lot of ways, since this book is about storytelling, you actually had the experience that we had reading it, is that we have one expectation about so many of the stories and so many of the people in the book, and we're continually confounded. I would just like to note, I also lived in a studio in Queens, but I faced gas tanks. So I'm wondering what story you would have gotten that from.
Just way less romantic.
Yeah. Lisa.
Which character did you start with first then, that you sort of fleshed out? Was it?
Jack was first for
Okay.
me. Yeah. He's more familiar to me. I didn't grow up in a grand house in New England, so Elizabeth was a little more of a stretch to write. Jack was closer to home. So I grew up in the Midwest, kind of all over. My dad moved us around a lot. So I was born in Iowa, but lived in Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, and I wrote about Iowa a lot in the Knicks, and in this book, I decided to write about Kansas, and that's mostly because of the lockdown. I was writing this story during the pandemic, and I was just feeling very, very claustrophobic, stuck in my house. And the landscape in my life that I most associate with openness is the Flint Hills in Kansas. Does anybody know? Has anybody ever driven through? A couple, not that many. It's incredibly beautiful. If for whatever reason, if you're ever on a road trip to like Wichita, I don't know why. Yeah.
Go to the bookstore.
The bookstore,
Yeah,
to
the
go
bookstore.
to yeah, if you Watermark.
Watermark.
Yeah. You'll drive through the Flint Hills, and it is the last large tract of tall grass prairie that's left in America. The prairie used to extend, from northern Texas to about Minnesota, from roughly Denver to Chicago. But all of that was taken out by agriculture, so that's all farmland now. But they couldn't make farms in the Flint Hills because of the rock in the ground. And so it's still rangeland, and it's still prairie, and it is one of the most beautiful, I think, landscapes that I've ever seen, and it's very underappreciated. It's just gentle rolling hills forever, and like often you'll see no trees, no water features, nothing, but just hills forever, which sounds kind of boring, but when you're standing in it, I trust me, it's gorgeous. And yeah, so I brought that feeling that mostly because of the pandemic. Like I wanted, if I couldn't see vistas in my life, I could have them in my imagination. So and then Jack grows up in a kind of rural childhood, but he yearns to be a city kid in the arts, which is basically my story too.
Turn myself off. There, I'm on again. Okay, so the Flint Hills are, and it's that vastness that you use in the story to open up spaces, and you flesh that out with Jack. It becomes sort of a character in itself, part of his identity.
Yeah. And I do that with space in the novel. The space between them is an alley at the beginning, and then 20 years later, Elizabeth wants to have separate bedrooms, and the space increases, and then of course when we're in the Flint Hills, this space is maximal. So I like playing with scale and space quite a lot.
And on Elizabeth's side, her space is very small in that room that she goes to, and it's very crowded. And there's a lot of abundance with the trees in Connecticut and various. So you've got your scarcity and your abundance going on.
Yeah, exactly. I can't say it better. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
A plus.
All right, the interview's over. Well, one of the things that's really interesting about Elizabeth to me, you said is that you have, that she has to they both have to come to terms with their lineage, their parents, but she has to come to terms with the wealth of the family. This is something that seems to be a lot of writers are thinking about when people are wealthy and where did that money come from? And it so ties into, I was going to ask what you thought your overlying themes, but were, because there's so much in this book, there's so many interesting things, there's so much detail, there's so much data, but it feels like one of the things is stories that we tell ourselves to override the reality of this.
Yeah, the kind of the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, or the stories we tell about our families, how we define the people in our lives, and yeah, that house came from a buddy of mine got married at this like grand house in Connecticut once, and it's one of those places like a butler's area and servants' quarters. It's like, and it's quite old, and 4 stories. And anyway, I was asking him like, how did the family build this? Like, what kind of money could have done that? And his answer was this family was basically responsible for like deforesting all of Western Connecticut, and it's like, yeah, I think a lot of like great fortunes have that story underneath it, but like the story we've been telling for a long time is, it's about pluck and it's about hard work and it's about what have you. So there are lots of different ways to tell that story, and of course the family tells it in a maximally ingratiating way, and Elizabeth, after she leaves, decides to tell it in a maximally I don't know, what's the opposite of ingratiating? Offensive way.
You have so many kind of swing for the fences moments, but the Augustine family history is definitely one of them.
Thank you.
It's hilarious and enlightening, and
yeah, I invented I was like, what's a ridiculous way that somebody could use like graft and cunning to make a lot of money, back in the day, and came up with this like crazy scheme involving like the Civil War and sweetened condensed milk. You'll just have to read it if you don't know. and then I was like, okay, challenge accepted. Like the next generation of awful dude, like what's he gonna do? And I'm like, can I make it even worse? And yes, I could make it even worse. And then the next generation, can it be even more ugly? And yes, we can make it even more ugly. So like every generation of like really rich swindler gets worse and worse and worse.
It makes me wonder which ones were left on the table.
Oh.
Were there some so bad you just couldn't?
No, they were too nice. That wasn't bad enough.
Well, speaking of nice and bad, are there villains or heroes in the story? Do you see it that way? And who would they be?
I just want to say, I was saying to Lisa beforehand that one of your interviewers said there are no villains in this book. I'm like, what?
Me too.
Well, now I want to know who you think the villain. I mean, Elizabeth's father is a straight up villain for sure. Like, yeah, no doubt. I don't have very much sympathy for that guy. I think a lot of the other characters, though, like even if they're a little villainous occasionally, I feel like I have some sympathy for them, and I mean, as soon as you start going into somebody's head, as soon as you start, try to explaining their motivations, it's kind of hard not to have sympathy for them. So any character that I spend some time with, eventually I'm just like, oh, okay, like, yeah, they're a terrible person, but also not so different from that time when I was sort of terrible, like it's you can always kind of find yourself within them, the more you dig, I think.
Let's talk about Ruth then.
Oh, Ruth. Okay. Yeah.
Can we talk about Ruth?
Okay. Yeah. Jack's mother, Ruth. Okay. Go.
I say you go. She was hard. And
Yeah.
I had a hard time finding a space to be sympathetic with her.
Yeah.
You could even somewhat feel a little more sympathetic with Brandy, sort of, maybe. They almost feel like the opposite sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Ruth is, she's inspired by a narcissist in my family who got much more narcissistic when she got very old, and kind of lost her faculties, and that's sort of what Ruth is. I mean, she's that person who, anything that happens in the world, she translates it as a story that reflects on her, so if Jack wants to go outside, she'll be like, well, what, am I not good enough for you? It's a classic narcissistic behavior, and yeah, she's, but then again, she has the story where she basically married this guy whom she knew did not love her, and has been then kind of taking it out on him ever since, so I understand where it's coming from. Obviously I can't support the means, but I think she's got some heartbreak in her life,
Yeah.
I'm just, one of the things about the book is it is very, very, very placey about Wicker Park, and it is very unplacey about the suburb that they want to move to. And I'm just curious. I mean, I guess some of it was probably, well, we aren't responsible, the people who live in our suburb, but I'm just curious, was there another reason besides you don't want to make any particular suburb seem this awful, or was there another reason for making it some sort of vague idealistic place?
No, I think if I would have named an actual place, that would have just been rude, like like they're not great people, the people that they meet in the fictional park shore that they want to move to. It's not a great experience they have out there. So I didn't want to, I don't know, I didn't want to indict an actual town. Like, every town's full of nice people. So it just seemed rude.
Maybe but they weren't representing all the town. The point, so because really the basic story in the now is that they want to move to a suburban school district to be closer to a private school for their kid who they're having trouble with, and they get sort of involved in, she gets involved in befriending a person who, Brandy, who is, how should one say, how should one you say where Brandy is? I don't know what she is.
She's needing stability.
Yeah.
And she's trying to make her own.
Yeah, I mean, that whole sequence about going out to the moving from the city, going into the suburbs. I remember when I was in my 20s and like in the 90s, and it was like, from the suburbs was like the worst thing you could be, and like now I look back and I'm like, well, that's idiotic. That's really dumb. That's very surfacey, and it all, and also, like, I was writing this at a time when all of my friends were having kids, so I have this like group of very good friends down in Florida. We're all about the same age when we met, and in our late 20s, early 30s. And, we would travel together and party together and like go watch movies at each other's houses, like very close friends. And then all of them, except for my wife and I, all of them had kids at about the same time, and so I had this kind of front row seat for what that is like, and people make really different choices once they become parents, and understandably, once they're responsible for somebody else. So Jack and Elizabeth, who always thought, no, I'd never move to the suburbs, suddenly it's like, no, that's the best place for Toby, so we're going to do it. And additionally, like, I was really inspired by my friends who, roundly, all of them, I think, are fabulous parents, are very, very good and giving their whole soul to the endeavor, working really hard. And then I would ask them, how's it going? Going over. My wife and I would like go over to their places with like a cocktail shaker after bedtime, so we could have like one cocktail with our friends before they'd like pass out, and we'd get to see them, and we'd say, how's it going? And all of them would say, oh God, I failed today. I failed at being a parent today. And they, things like, I would, maybe I was too short with her here. I let her have too much screen time over here, what have you, like something they could pick out something in the day that they didn't do perfectly. And I was just thinking, like, where did this standard come from, that like to be a good parent you had to do everything perfectly, and so yeah, it was just, the decision making around parenthood was driving them crazy, and from the inside they felt they were failing, and from the outside I was like, you guys are incredible, and so there was this tension there that I really wanted to mine.
And you turn that into Elizabeth's parenting tips.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Elizabeth is a parent who wants all of her parental decisions to be informed by the best science. And she's a psychologist, so I imagine that she had this kind of Rolodex in her mind of like all the studies that she had read, yeah, and she's trying to get Toby out of this picky eating phase, and it's just not going well. And everything she does seems to backfire on her somehow, even though she's following the best science. And it was just a reflection of me watching my own friends, and they would like look up on the internet, what should I do about this problem? And then invariably, because kids are weird and very idiosyncratic, like they'd have to figure out the solution themselves,
And it was an amazing solution.
Yeah.
When
right.
it came down to it. And it's hard because there's so much you want to talk about, but it's the reveal of how it builds and builds and builds. So I feel like, it's not really like giving it away, but it's sort of like spoiling it.
There are spoilers, and we will not
are.
talk about them.
Yeah.
But there's so much other things in the book that are sort of rabbit hole. They're more of the rabbit holes.
And this was sort of like a complete left-sided solution to what was going on with Toby's eating.
Yeah. I mostly that it just cracked me up. I finished writing this one chapter, and it's like, if you haven't read the book, it is a dramatization of 1 hour of toddler childcare. And it is like 30 pages long. And weirdly, in the audiobook, it lasts exactly 1 hour. I did not plan that, but it just worked out that way. And so after that, I wanted some kind of coda, some very short 2 to 3 page, like something really, really small and punchy. And so the solution to Toby's eating problem ends up being, I think, hilarious. But
so did I.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Perfect.
You have, as I said, this book has so many different kind of ideas built into it, and much like the Knicks, has a number of swing for the fences kind of moments. What do you think was your biggest swing in the book?
The algorithm section, for sure, which is I don't know, controversial. Like
polarizing.
Some people love it. Some people are just like, I'm so bored with this, and that's fine. It is a weird section, but I decided to write. I would try to dramatize the dissolution of a relationship between Jack and his father, and try to do it from the point of view of the social media algorithms that are making it happen. And I was inspired to write this based on friends of mine and family members of mine that I started losing circa like 2014, 2015, when like people on my Facebook feed started to get like weird, and weirder and weirder still, as time passed. And there's one friend in particular that I remember kind of arguing with, because he was a buddy of mine, and I knew we voted differently, but that didn't matter. We hung out. It was fine. But then he just started, posting these things that were plainly not true. And so I would email him privately and just be like, I don't think this is true, or private message him via Facebook. I don't think this is true. And I would like send him links, and he would send me links, and we would talk about it and like start fighting about it. And then he'd post something else, and we'd fight about that, and all privately. I didn't want to do it in front of anybody, but then I noticed one day that, and this was obviously a strain on our friendship. I noticed one day that Facebook was offering me up something that he had posted 3 weeks ago that I had missed the first time around. And I was like, what is going on here? Like, this is ruining our friendship. And Facebook is like, do you want more of it? You know? And back then, I mean, when I started writing this kind of stuff in like 2017, this was all still a mystery. There has since been some very good journalism on this subject, so I'm not breaking any news here, but like I wanted to kind of dramatize what that felt like to like slowly lose somebody to internet rabbit holes. And I also wanted to understand what was going on underneath the hood of these platforms. So I read hundreds of pages of like Facebook patent applications, because Facebook is very, very hush hush about its algorithms, but all of them are patented, you know, and in the patent application, obviously you don't get access to the math of the algorithm, but you get access to the engineers explaining what it does and why it's necessary. So you can get a really good sense of what the company is up to by reading these patent applications. So I read hundreds of pages of them to try to understand the underlying mathematics and try to understand kind of the underlying motivations, and then used a lot of that material in that section.
And then you talked about how the story itself is kind of on the hyperlinks and how that feeds in. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah,
and
sure.
That's my repeat for the day.
That's the repeat? Okay, no problem. No problem. Yeah, does anybody remember hypertext literature from the 90s? Yeah, so a few. Yeah. Okay, a couple people. I was super into it. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, it's no big deal. What it was like it was computer literature that had a bunch of links in it, basically. And instead of reading a book, say, linearly, the way an author presents it, you would, encounter a chunk of text, and there would be 3 links into it in it, and you would click on a link, and it would take you to another chunk of text, and you would read that, and you would kind of explore a story rather than kind of read it linearly, like an author might intend. And all the kind of hypertext theorists at the time, who I was like reading and enamored by, were all saying like, this is a more democratic, less fascist way to read. You get to read it in your own pace, and people were making huge, predictions that in the future, all great literature will be hypertext, which is hilarious to look back at now. But it was just an example of like academic theory outrunning empirical reality. But I was super into it and really theoretically enjoyed the idea of bits of text connecting via a link, this kind of tether, between these 2 bits of text. And so when I was writing this book, the way I was thinking of it in my mind, and this is not necessary at all for you to know to enjoy the book. You don't need to know this, but this was just for me, that every chapter would feel like a link from the previous chapter. So there would be something in the previous chapter that if you clicked on it, you would get to this chapter you're on now. And then something in that chapter that if you clicked on it would get to this chapter, and on and on and on and on. So it flies back and forth in time, but I was hoping that you would feel like tethers to what you just read. That's probably going to be invisible for a lot of the time, but that was the way I organized it myself.
But I really loved that part of it because you could see the way conversations or things were sort of working back and forth and bouncing off of each other and coming back up.
Yeah,
just like life.
Yeah, and
just like our problems.
It's true.
Just
yeah,
like, it comes around and around.
Yeah, I was kind of envisioning it as a network, and the thing that really was interesting to me was social media is what happens when you do that same process where you try to network a bunch of things together. Social media is what happens when you do that same process, but you do it at scale, and you do it algorithmically and mathematically. So the hypertext artists were doing it in a kind of human way, and social media is doing it in a kind of algorithmic way.
Does this it seems to tie into, you've talked a few times about like the Greek words for time, the what is it? Chronos versus Kairos.
Yeah.
And will you talk a little about that and how you tried to structure the book so that the parts of the book in the past didn't really feel like flashbacks?
Yeah, you have been listening to interviews.
It's insecurity.
Someone's done his homework. Yeah, and this is mentioned in the book too. One of the characters kind of says this, and where I kind of tip my hand a little bit. But yeah, in ancient Greek there are two words that we now translate as time, and they're very different in Greek. One is chronos, which is, we know that very well, just like kind of the forward moving countable time, and the other is kairos, and that can refer to a lot of things, but it can refer to a moment in time that is ideal, like an opportunity, an opportune time. It could also refer to moments in time that feel smashed together. So I don't know, I go share Christmas with my family every year, and so every year there's like a kind of kairotic connection between all the previous Christmases. They're all kind of smashing together, so ritual and history and all kind of compressing. Yeah, so I wanted to arrange this book not chronologically but chirologically, so that those connections feel, they land on you a little harder. And it's also why I wanted to set the book in Wicker Park. Like, walking through Wicker Park, it's a neighborhood that has experienced so much change. It was the center of industrial Chicago at the turn of the century, and then abandoned for a very long time, and then it was it was a kind of a gritty Bohemia for a time, and then kind of the locus of the transformation into a kind of information economy. And walking through Wicker Park is an exercise in kairos, because you see a building that, for example, was a factory and a sweatshop in one era, and then it was a warehouse in another era, and it was a shooting gallery in another era, and then it was this is a true story, the home to a coffee shop, and then the home to MTV's The Real World when it was in Chicago, and now it's a gym. And all of these layers all are stacked upon each other simultaneously, and that's kairos.
What's the new book that's out that looks at the one house?
Daniel Mason,
yes,
right?
Yeah, Daniel Mason.
Northwoods.
Northwoods.
Yeah. It's a great book. It's a great book.
I was going to ask you, I feel like and I don't think we talked enough about it before, so I would like you to talk about placebos and how they tie in to all the themes of this novel.
Sure. Yeah. Placebo. You're asking me all the most pointy-headed questions. I love it. I get to, I never get to talk about this stuff. This is great. Yeah, so placebo entered the book. Elizabeth specializes in the placebo effect. She's a placebo researcher, and she works at an institute called the Institute for Placebo Research. But where the novel gets its name is that you can't just put the Institute for Placebo Research on the door, because everybody then will know they're getting a placebo, and then placebo won't work. So they have to have a kind of generic name, and that name is wellness, which is a word that's so generic it can mean anything. Yeah, so placebo, we get that word. That is a word that we have received via 14th century funerals. Did you know this? Yeah, placebo is Latin. It means to please or to be pleasing. And in the 14th century, there was this practice where you would pay people to mourn at your family's members' funerals. And the beginning of the liturgy for these funerals began with a psalm that started placebo domino in regione vivorum. I will please the Lord in the land of the living. And so the people who were paid to mourn at funerals were called placebos, and it was only much later that the word started having a medical connotation. But I was into this idea because so placebo is just historically it means to be pleasing, but it also means to be fake, and that's what's going on with my two characters. Like, they have twisted themselves up in order to be pleasing to each other, in order to be pleasing to their families, in order to be pleasing to culture's expectations of them. And it is unraveling that is kind of their central problem. So it just seemed I don't know, thematically relevant, and also very, very fun to read about and write about. Placebo, super interesting.
And I guess you would say that it's placebo is a story that does a better job than the actual truth.
It's in one of my favorite examples of this. So acupuncture for lower back pain famously does not, do anything better than placebo. Like both placebo acupuncture and actual acupuncture have about a 44% success rate, and placebo acupuncture is just like somebody pricking you with toothpicks and you don't know it. You think you're getting the real thing. But here's the really neat thing. There was a follow-up study that if you get fake acupuncture, placebo acupuncture from a physician who seems very cold and robotic and distant, it is less effective than getting it from a physician that is very warm and encouraging and touches you in a warm and comforting way. And so what that reveals to me is just like, yeah, it's a story, but it's just an indication that like we need to be cared for, we need to be listened to, we need to be taken seriously, and I think we all realize that most of us are in a healthcare system that doesn't do that very, very, very well. And so, so we go looking for it in other ways, and I totally get that.
Well, I want to talk about the nothing and the nothingness and the nothingness that each of them are both seeking after. The placebo is the nothingness and the artwork. And where did you, in the story of pulling this all together, where did that come up? And you had that aha
And explain a little about the nothingness.
Yeah.
nothingness.
Yeah.
Yes. Well,
Yeah. So Elizabeth studies studies placebo. She's giving literally nothing to people. She's giving a story, but in terms of the pills that she's prescribing to her patients, it's nothing. It's sugar pill. It's inert, And Jack is a specialist in a kind of art that is an abstract photography called chemograms. That is cameraless photography. It's where you take like black and white photo paper and use the various chemicals and reagents of the photographic process to create abstract designs on that photo paper. So you can create these really neat designs. And there are some pictures in the book of his art that I actually made in my garage. And they look really beautiful. But he insists that they're pictures of nothing because they're pure form, they're abstract, they're disconnected from meaning. And so one character in the book points out at a very inopportune moment, but points out like you both are specialized in nothingness. He's about nothingness in art and you are nothingness in science. And there must be some, like, why are you drawn to this? There must be some great hole inside you that you need to fill. And it's kind of a crisis moment realizing this for both my characters.
But what was it like for you to come to that aha moment of
my book is about nothing, like Seinfeld.
Gosh, it's so funny. Like books twist and turn and accrete in such weird ways over such a long time. Like I started writing this in like 2015, and I'm trying to remember like when I came up with that line. I feel like it's delivered by this guy named Kyle, who is it turns out like maybe the most savvy relationship pseudo counselor in the book, and I think I was just writing that scene and I was trying to come up with something devastating for him to say, and I was just workshopping it, just spitballing like what could be the devastating thing that he says, and I think that one won.
And he said it at a sex club.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
To note.
Yeah, it's a great scene.
Oh, I just asked.
Oh, well, I was thinking before we go to questions, we're having a little show and tell. And, sometimes you go to these events and we say to the author, what are you reading? And they say, the classics of some sort, but we're not doing that. So we have actually a couple of books that Nate loves.
Yeah. I read both of these very recently. And so I'd like to talk to them about, the first is Tell Me I'm an Artist by Chelsea Martin. And this is a novel about a young woman who is in art school, and it's basically about this woman who she's doing an art project, and she decides to recreate frame for frame Wes Anderson's Rushmore without ever having actually seen Rushmore. She's just gonna like create the kind of text of Rushmore. But so that's just funny, and she's a very funny writer. But what I really liked about this book is something that I wrote about in Wellness a little bit too, from the point of view of Jack, is that her character, goes to art school and encounters all of these people who, like it or not, like a lot of people who are in the arts also have a lot of means. You know, they can afford to be in the arts, and this character does not come from means, and Jack does not come from means, and neither did I. Like I remember when I went to my first art classes and saw art in person for the first time. The people around me were all making fun of it. They're like, "Oh, that's tourist bait. That's tourist bait." About the art that I was like seeing for the first time, and it made me. I was like, "Wow, I need to like never like shut up and never say anything for like 10 years until I catch up." And that's where this character is coming from, and it's a really great novel about class and art, and it's also very funny, so I liked it a lot. And then the other one is a book, and I noticed that he's coming to this store in a couple weeks, I believe,
November 9th, maybe. Anyway.
And it's The Last Supper Club, A Waiter's Requiem by Matthew Bott, who is a Wisconsin guy. He's also a former colleague of mine. We taught in the same English department for a while, and I blurbed this book because it is so good. It's brand new, and it is a memoir about when Matt decided to take a sabbatical from the university where we both taught at, and then realized kind of right at the beginning of the sabbatical, oh no, I don't have enough money to make it through the sabbatical, and takes a job waiting tables. And so it is a history of it is a kind of piece of journalism about this particular restaurant that he worked at, which was the restaurant that it was associated with the Surly Brewing Company, if you know Surly beer. And it was open for a very short time, and it was an award-winning restaurant, and then it promptly closed in a very kind of controversial way. So it is a kind of a history of this restaurant. It's also a history of Matt's interest in waiting tables. He put himself through college and grad school waiting tables, and is just talking about like his various experiences doing restaurant work, and then a really interesting meditation on just the nature of work and what jobs we give esteem to culturally and what jobs we don't, and how he's all of his colleagues were saying like, you are a university professor, why are you waiting tables? And he's like, honestly, I like it better, and so it's just an interesting. I just found it to be it's called The Last Supper Club. Yeah.
So we have copies at the front desk. I mean, not at the front desk. It's on the gondola where we have the upcoming programs. Really, we grabbed it out of the back room this evening. I mean, when we say new, we mean
brand new. Yeah.
So, do you want to one more question and then open up, or should we open up?
What time are we at?
We're at the time when we would open it up.
Okay, well, let's open it up.
Whatever questions people have, and really anything. My favorite question on tour so far, there was this 9-year-old boy who raised his hand in one of my readings, like seriously, probably 9. And so obviously I called on him, and he said, forgive me, I haven't read the book yet. But I couldn't help but notice that there's a triangle on the cover, and triangles are my favorite shape. What is your favorite shape? That's my favorite question from tour so far. So the answer is a triangle. Obviously, the triangle is my favorite shape. The cover of the book, if you notice, has a couple inscribed within its central triangle, and I liked that when I first saw it. The way I saw it was like it's almost like this couple is on a red carpet extending into the horizon, and I was like, how appropriate! It's like they're walking into the future together. And then I talked to my book designer, and he's like, oh no, that's not what I meant. And I was like, it's like, what did you mean? And he said, I just thought that the triangle of all the primary shapes is the most sinister shape. And he's like, if like a cult has a logo, it'll probably be a triangle. And he thought that my central couple was like a cult of 2, so he put them in a triangle. So I was like, great, that'll work. That works too. Yeah.
I will repeat the question. So, go ahead. Okay, I think I can do this. Piece in each book that made me go, huh. Were you writing towards it? Did you know? Did it come to you afterwards? No, we do know, you haven't mentioned it, but we will note this book was not written in this order.
Right.
And so it's a patchwork.
I assume in both books you're talking about like kind of something very close to the end in the last or second to last chapter. Yeah, I thank you for that. I'm glad it landed well. And it's always so funny, like the responses you get from readers. I had the neat thing about about having a new book, among many neat things, is that my friends have been live texting me their reading experiences, and it's really fun to see what catches them. Like, one friend texted after she got done with the whole book, and she's like, "Love the book, haha, pickles." And I was like, I wrote about pickles? And I was like, I had to really search my mind. I was like, oh yeah, there's that thing about that joke about pickles. It's like, that was the thing that she remembered. But the thing that I'm pretty sure you're talking about, the passages that I'm pretty sure you're talking about, come in both books after the end of a very long writing process. And like, part of the writing process for me is just figuring out what I'm saying, what I think, like working out stuff that I'm confused about or upset about. And I finally figure it out years into the project. And then somewhere I feel like, well, I need to wear my heart on my sleeve somewhere. If I'm going to, write a 600-page quasi satire, should be really sincere at some point, or else it's just bad manners, and so, like, yeah, there's in both books there are places where I'm just like, okay, this is just my unarmored heart, and I'm just glad that you took it in that spirit. Thank you. Yeah. No, none. Yeah.
Background in psychology.
Yeah. Do I have background in psychology? No, I have none. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to say compliment on psychology.
Yeah. Thank you. I will. Most of that is coming from, in this book anyway, most of that is coming from the fact that Elizabeth is a psychologist, and so I wanted to dive deeply into her field in order to be able to just write her correctly and authoritatively, and I just got so into it. I got so into it, and I mean, my research was thorough but messy, so I would just find studies that I was super interested in, and then look at their citations and read all those studies and essays, and then, like, on Google Scholar, like, go and see, like, since that cool study was published, who has cited that study, and just kind of spider web out from my favorite places. Yeah, I feel like I should at least have a bachelor's degree by now in that subject for how much reading I did. Like, whole bankers boxes, I would print them all out too, because I like just underlying stuff on paper. And yeah, bankers box is full of this research, and it was joyful. I just really found that I was like, I wish I would have studied this when I was, in school. Thank you. The question, well, the comment is about the marshmallow test and how it's used in the book. And if you don't know, the marshmallow test is that famous Stanford study where they gave small children a marshmallow, and they said, you can have this marshmallow now if you want to, but if you wait 15 minutes, then we'll give you 2 marshmallows. And the question was, could they resist the temptation or could they not? And then they tracked these kids into adulthood, and what they found allegedly was that the kids who could resist the marshmallow had better outcomes, like in life, had fewer encounters with the law, fewer like drunk driving incidents, and the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, and that stood as just fact for a very long time. And then we've been reinterpreting some of these things and rerunning those experiments, as well we should, and discovering, well, no, what's maybe actually going on is that the kids who could resist the marshmallow were mostly rich, and they're like, I can get as many marshmallows as I want, so okay, whatever, I'll resist it. And the kids who didn't resist the marshmallow were mostly not, and they were like, well, you don't if you live in a state of want, you don't take up you don't pass a sure thing up, and they took the marshmallow. And it has nothing to do with patience or delayed gratification. It's just about class, and it shouldn't really surprise us that later in life the rich kids have better outcomes than the poor kids do, and it doesn't really tell us anything about patience, and yeah, and so this is a book about the stories we tell ourselves, and you can look at the same data and tell 2 radically different stories about the same stuff, and so Elizabeth is telling herself a certain story about herself as a mother, and then in that moment she realizes maybe it's just a story.
All the way in the back. Talk about a deep dive into the signage on the wellness clinic.
So one of the things that placebo respond that one vector of placebo is just context. So, for example, placebo pain pills work better if it's given to you by a doctor in a lab coat rather than a doctor in a dirty old T-shirt. You know, like symbols matter, and so I thought, well, if that's true, let's just take this to a kind of absurd degree. And so like the whole office that Elizabeth works in is modular so that they can create the proper context for whatever placebo they are testing, and even the outside sign. So if they're testing, one kind of product, they will use one kind of sign, and that I play around with typography in the print version of the book, and you can see the signs that are used for the various experiments. And when we were talking about the cover, we were looking for something that kind of echoed the typography of the Knicks, because I just wanted that. It was like the Knicks is just very recognizable, and especially it was especially recognizable during the pandemic behind people on Zoom calls. My agent and editor were like sending me screenshots of guess who, Anna Wintour has her book behind her, like things like that. It was really fun to see. Like Reese Witherspoon has your book in her kid's bedroom, that was pretty cool. And so I was like, okay, let's maybe echo that typography, but not repeat it completely. And then also, the word wellness is such a, as you know, cliche word. It's such an overused word, and I'm using it exactly for that reason. It's so generic, it can mean anything. But I wanted to kind of weird the word, just make you have to take a second look at it, make it look not so cliche. And so we decided to, double truck it, and just to make it look just a little more strange. Yeah.
Let's see. Okay. Great question. Is there something about Chicago that speaks to you?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I grew up all over the Midwest, and Chicago is kind of the urban capital of the Midwest, and but I think more than that, for me, it was just kind of a level of familiarity and alienness, and I'll explain it. So my wife and I, we go to Chicago, or we did go to Chicago every year for like 15 years. My wife is a musician, or was a musician in the Grant Park Symphony in Chicago, which, if you don't know, is a concert series that plays in downtown Chicago, and they put on free concerts in this amazing Frank Gehry shell. It's that area right close to the lake, right next to the Bean, if you know Chicago. And she would play these concerts, and I would be in the audience watching, and it was divine. I loved it. Take a picnic, a bottle of wine, go see a concert. Anyway, and so we would spend our summers in Chicago. So we live in Florida most of the year, but we'd come up to Chicago every summer for 15 years. And so I would go to Wicker Park, for example, and see how it had changed in that year, and see how my favorite cafe was now an Urban Outfitters or whatever. And how the neighborhood slowly changed. And there's something about Chicago for me that is good is really great as a setting, because I know it well enough to write about it, but I also don't know it well enough that there's some mystery and allure and even nostalgia that I feel for it. I have a real hard time writing about where I actually live, because there's very little mystery there for me, So Chicago is really nice because I've never been a full-time Chicagoan, but I know it well enough that I can write about it, but there's enough of a gap that my imagination can fill into it, or my nostalgia for the place can kind of fill into it. So yeah, I like settings that like the Flint Hills, which I hadn't been to in a long time, but kind of long to go back to, or in the Knicks, like the area in eastern, rural eastern Iowa, where my family comes from. I hadn't been back there in a long time, and so I wanted to pour myself into that because I feel nostalgic for it. So there's something about that feeling of nostalgia and longing that I really like, that lends my writing on on setting a certain sort of, I don't know, kind of golden tint that I really like.
I think that was our last question, but I just wanted to note the come with when they meet is such a romantic kind of moment to it, and I wound up doing a deep dive, and because people kept talking about it. So this is the map of Come With and how it is used in the United States, and it is only really representative of Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Chicago.
Yeah, that's and not in New England. So yeah, so
not in New England.
Elizabeth hears. So the first two words that Jack says to Elizabeth are "come with." He's leaving a bar and she's on a terrible date, and he's like, "Come with." And it was something that I heard growing up. Like I remember like kids on their bikes riding past my house, yelling, "Come with," and I wanted this moment for Elizabeth I wanted Jack to say something to her that's like completely innocent, completely without guile, and "come with" seemed to do it. I had no idea about that map, but that's really great.
I wanted to, would you like to say the benediction, so to speak?
The benediction.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. This is such a unique experience to come to Boswell and do this event here, and then do it at Books and Company earlier in the day. And an honor to be with you. This is an amazing
Thank
book.
you. Yeah, the Wisconsin doubleheader. This was great.
I know. And all in one day.
Yeah. Thank you for coming out, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. This is being recorded unless I accidentally hit the button wrong, and it'll be up, and we'd love for you to share it with your friends. Thank you all.